Our guest this morning is Dr. Edward J. Watts. He's returning to the show. He's been on quite a few times. One of our favorite guests and friends here at the show. Dr. Watts is a professor of history at the University of California in San Diego. Dr. Watts is the author of numerous seminal books on Roman history, including The Final Pagan Generation, The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome, and the topic of our discussion this morning, Mortal Republic, How Rome Fell into Tyranny. So without further ado, Dr. Watts, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be back and to move back in time to the Roman Republic.
Oh yeah, I know. As we were talking backstage, I know you're stuck in the 7th century right now, and I was apologizing to bring you back from one volatile time to yet another volatile time in history. So so we're going to be exploring, as Dr. Michelle Salzman would say, crises, resilience, and change. But this is actually a very interesting time because the time period we're looking at, the 3rd century BCE, it's kind of post-Alexander and the rise of the Hellenistic kingdoms, but Rome is kind of coming on as like a new power on the scene. So I didn't know if you could just provide a snapshot of where Rome was at in the early 3rd century, like for the beginning of the 3rd century, like 280s. Where is it at politically, economically, militarily?
It's a very interesting moment in Roman history. I think when we in the 21st century think of Rome, we think of it as a kind of machine that's always moving forward and always expanding. And that's true for a lot of Roman history, especially the Roman history of the later Republic. But it wasn't actually true for a lot of the 5th and early part of the 4th century BC. Rome was really struggling. There were a set of invasions into the Italian peninsula that had really slowed down Rome's ability to expand, and it really had retrenched to a kind of position of defensiveness. And in the course of the later part of the 4th century, Rome sort of got its act together. The incursions of people from the central Italian hills had stopped. Rome had managed to put together a group of allies, and it had started again expanding. And at the end of the 4th century BC, there's a generation of kind of Roman, I suppose we could call them like, Roman expendables, maybe, like a group of really hardcore good generals who come together and win a victory that ultimately leads to Roman domination of much of the Italian peninsula. But it was a kind of hard fought thing. It was in a sense Rome and its allies against more or less everybody else in central Italy. And when they win this victory, Rome positions itself as a dominant force in central and southern Italy, but it was a relatively new position. And the interesting thing as you get into the 280s is some of that old generation is still around. Not many of them, but of those generals who were brought in to win this great victory, a couple are still around. And one of them is Appius Claudius, who is this, at this point, very old, broken down, blind guy who can barely walk and is not super involved in political life, but he is in a sense like a living fossil from that time period when Rome achieved its hegemony over Italy. And so as you get into the 280s, what you have is a generation in the Roman Senate, which didn't experience that directly. But they know the position that these people won. But there are still people around who had fought in those wars and had, in a sense, won for Rome this position of dominance in Italy. But the position itself is relatively new. And it's so new, in fact, that there are people who remember when it was kind of touch and go, whether not even Rome would dominate Italy, but whether Roman predominance in central Italy would even be maintained. And so the 280s is an interesting moment because Rome is very powerful, but it also remembers the threat of not being powerful. It's within living memory that you can look back and say, wait, this could have gone a totally different direction.
Yeah, excellent points. Sorry, excuse me. And just by the way, everybody, these are live shows. So once they're up, they're only up for like 6 hours after I stream them. And then I take them down and edit them and they'll be up at a later time. So if you're here, welcome to the ritual. We are all experiencing the liveness, and any guffaws will be gone in the edited version. But We're just having fun here. But yeah, Dr. Watts, it's very interesting. What really struck me in the book, the first chapter, when Rome has these encounters with Pyrrhus of Epirus, right? And he sends he sends these envoys, and they come back and they're like, they're not interested. And he's like, what? And then you have Fabricius come and like, the king is offering him all these riches, and he's turning everything down, and he doesn't really understand it. But then Fabricius gives this speech about the honors and the prestige that he holds in Rome, and how could I betray that? And if I get any ill gains, then they have systems in place that can find things like that out. And you said it was at that point that Pyrrhus, the king, really understood, this is what I'm dealing with here. That I have a problem.
Yeah. So the next phase of Roman dominance in Italy is this phase of kind of manufacturing wars in southern Italy. And central Italy and northern Italy, these are areas that are kind of independent areas from the larger Mediterranean political structures. But southern Italy is Greek. And those cities in southern Italy are places that have very strong connections to the Greek world. And in the Greek world in the 280s BC, you are just after Alexander the Great. And so there's massive power in the Greek world and massive ability to draw upon resources that these Italian cities that Rome has been beating up, they don't have this. And so when Rome provokes conflict in southern Italy, the city of Tarentum in southern Italy decides to appeal for help from the Greek mainland. And they get Pyrrhus of Epirus, who for a very little while, he's related to Alexander the Great. For a very little while, he actually controlled the territory that was the initial germ of Alexander's empire. And Pyrrhus is basically an adventurer who more or less has this grand idea of going to the west, building a set of dependent allies, conquering Sicily, and then going back and taking over Alexander's kingdom in the east. And so when Pyrrhus is summoned to Italy, he goes because he has this objective, and it looks like a good way to build connections in Italy. What Pyrrhus is hoping to do is show up, intimidate the Romans, get them to back down, and then maybe get the Romans to cooperate with him on his campaign of grandiosity going back to the east. And what he finds initially is he's expecting he can basically buy the Romans off, give their envoys gifts, encourage the envoys to believe that it's in the best interest of them as individuals, and maybe even best interest of Rome to not fight Pyrrhus. And when he tries to do this, Fabricius, who is the envoy who's sent there, basically says, you don't really understand our society, because we're not a rich society. I'm in the Senate. I'm an important person. I'm not wealthy. But if I were to suddenly become wealthy, everybody would know where that came from. And yeah, okay, I might have more money than I did before, but I would be totally dishonored. My children would be totally dishonored, and I would totally dishonor the memory of my ancestors by doing this kind of thing. And so what Fabricius is in essence telling Pyrrhus is, you work in one kind of economy that values things on the basis of how much they're worth in gold. I work in a different kind of economy. My economy is an economy of honor. And what I am doing in essence is superintending the honor that all of my ancestors have built up over many generations, and handing that honor down as the inheritance to my children. And in Rome, that's more important than any kind of money that I could give my family, and any kind of money that I could give my heirs. And Pyrrhus is kind of astonished by this. He doesn't understand how such a thing could even exist in a society that's modern by the 3rd century BC standards. And so Pyrrhus doesn't really know what to do, and so he fights a battle against the Romans. The interesting thing in that battle is, of course, Pyrrhus has these resources from the east, which includes war elephants. And when Pyrrhus takes the field against the Romans with these war elephants, it becomes very clear Romans have never seen these things before. They have no idea what to do with them. And even though they panic, they more or less find a way to hold their own. But after the battle, it's clear the Romans have lost. but they held their own well enough that they inflicted really serious casualties on Pyrrhus. And so Pyrrhus at this point wants to negotiate an end to this because he doesn't really want to fight to the death in southern Italy, right? This is all just sort of phase one of a much larger plan. And the troops that he has are professional soldiers. Professional soldiers are very difficult to replace, because there's a skill set that they possess that they've developed over time that you can't just, pull a guy off of a farm field and have him replicate. And so Pyrrhus realizes that fighting again against the Romans is going to lead to potential problems. And he tries to negotiate. And this is where we get to this very famous moment in the Roman Senate.
Yeah, where Appius Claudius kind of gets wheeled in there, and he gives that amazing oratory speech and denounces all these people. He's like, "What are you guys doing? This is insane. This like your ancestors would be ashamed of what you're even proposing here." So
exactly, because the Senate is, we think it's a bunch of old guys. It's actually, we don't know exactly what the demographics of the Senate in 280 BC was, but we know, like in the Empire, these people are in their 30s. And in the Republic, these guys went out and fought. Like they didn't just sit around. They weren't like modern American politicians who just sort of sit in Washington and debate things and then send someone else to go and fight the wars. They went and fought the wars. And so some of these guys had seen the elephants. Some of these guys had seen what Pyrrhus's forces could do. And they really want this to go away as well. And so there's a kind of meeting of the minds almost, where Pyrrhus has almost convinced them to vote on a peace treaty that will effectively say, yeah, all right, Pyrrhus will leave. We won't bother Tarentum, and we will be Pyrrhus's ally, but nothing more is needed from this situation. And then Appius Claudius, who's this fossil from this old generation that had won Rome, its empire, is carted into the Senate. I mean, literally cannot walk in, so they have to be carried into the Senate. And he says to them, in essence, my generation fought for this, and you're going to just give it away. We sort of put our lives on the line. We put the status of our society, we put the future of our society on the line. We won. And now you're just going to give it away to this guy who shows up from Greece. And Appius Claudius says to them, he's not going to be the only one. If you give in to him, other people are going to show up and they're going to do the same thing to you. How can you maintain this kind of position of power that we won for you when you're giving things away without fighting for it? And the Senate then decides, okay, yes, we're going to fight to the end. And the Pyrrhic Wars represent this moment where Rome, in essence, acknowledges the responsibilities of having this position of leadership in Italy and the costs that those responsibilities are going to inflict on Rome as a result of making decisions to maintain this position of leadership.
Yes, absolutely. And just getting to people like Fabricius and Appius Claudius, tell us a little bit about the structure of Roman political offices and how it changed during this period of time. This is what is usually called the cursus honorum. Like you were mentioning, there's a military service involved. It's unlike today where somebody like Matt Gaetz can just like show up out of nowhere and just make demands because he's entitled. This is like, these are people who are battle hardened through military service, and military service, in addition, has a land requirement. And these people are very much in the service of their country and in Rome, to defending that land and defending those ideals. So just kind of tell us a little bit about the offices.
Yeah, so there's an idea that, first of all, if you are going to serve in the army, you have to have a vested interest in the success of that army. And in the early part of the Roman Republic, the idea was the state's small. If you own property and the army loses, your property is likely to get destroyed or damaged. Your family is likely to get captured. If you don't have property, you might be more willing to kind of cut and run. And the great fear that Romans have is creating something that would be like a mercenary army, where you can just buy off the loyalty of the soldiers. And so the first thing that the Roman Republic expects is that you will own property, because then you're invested in the success or failure of that army. The second thing that Rome expects, though, is that for certain people in that society, they'll compete for political offices. And those political offices begin with relative levels of responsibility, usually involving some kind of fiscal management. Maybe they're minting coins as you get into the later part of the 2nd century, or you get into the later part of the 3rd century and early 2nd century. And then you build up in responsibilities as you prove yourself in these lower offices. And then the highest office that you could hold was the consulship. There are 2 of them every year. And this is kind of the inspiration for what the American presidency is. It's an executive office where you also have a position where you lead the armies. Now, our presidents sit in Washington, they don't actually go out and fight, but a consul would be expected in the Roman Republic to actually lead the armies, to go out, and if there's a campaign going on, you will lead the army as its primary general. But there's also this idea that every office must have a pair, because you don't ever want to create a situation where one individual can dominate or change the direction of Roman life without somebody who possesses equal power having the capacity to block them and block their initiatives that may potentially take Rome in a direction it doesn't want to go. There's one exception to this. If there is an emergency, a serious emergency, where you do not have the luxury of letting people with equal powers debate and find a compromise about a policy they want to pursue, Rome did permit the selection of a dictator for 6 months. When we think of a dictator, we think of someone like Nicolas Maduro or someone like this, who is a all-empowered, probably tyrannical figure who is doing horrible things. In Rome, dictatorship was actually a normal office. It was emergency office in that there had to be something really serious happening for you to appoint a dictator, but it wasn't unconstitutional to appoint a dictator. It wasn't a situation where the dictator has seized power illegally. The dictator, in fact, is legally empowered to do these things. But the position of dictator is something that is term limited. You can't be dictator for longer than 6 months in the Republic. And often it's also tied to a specific objective. So a group of people are invading Roman territory. You appoint someone as a dictator to deal with this invasion. Once the invasion's over, it's expected the dictator will step down. And so there's a very famous incident with a man named Cincinnatus, who is appointed dictator to deal with an invasion. He deals with the invasion in a matter of days, and then steps down. And so he doesn't serve the 6 months. He instead just relinquishes power, steps down, and goes back to his life, because it was not seen as appropriate for somebody who's appointed to solve a problem to hang on to power after that problem was solved. And so one of the people most inspired by the example of Cincinnatus was George Washington, who of course was empowered to lead colonial armies in the Revolution and then stepped down because the emergency was over. It's a real great act of sacrifice and citizenship. And Romans saw this as the way that Roman political figures are supposed to behave, not just as dictators, but in all capacities. You're supposed to protect the Republic, and you serve the Republic and its citizens, not yourself and not your own interests.
Yeah, all great points. Thank you for that answer. Yeah, it's very important to realize that it wasn't a perfect political system, but everybody, since they were working towards a common goal, understood the checks and balances, and that you weren't supposed to push those. There were unwritten rules. It's one way of putting it, where there are certain powers, but we can't push those powers because we understand, that everybody has to have a say and we have to compromise. And it worked really well for a while, until, of course, this huge expansion. It's like a 50 to 80 year period where Rome experiences this massive growth. It's almost by accident. And I'm thinking of something like their battles in the Punic War, where they don't even have experience with the Navy at this point, and they have to reverse engineer the ship, to fight effectively on. I'm thinking of those great passages in Polybius where he's talking about the Roman military does things versus like the phalanx, and why it was so effective. And it's insane, the ingenuity. Sorry, excuse me. That will be edited out. Sorry. It's just amazing, the ingenuity and the kind of almost ingenious way they have to work against these systems that their opponents are taking for granted as working all the time. And Romans have to improvise, and then improvising, they, in a sense, kind of become a huge dominant power during this period of time. So, like I said, tell us about the wars with Carthage. Sorry, let me start over. So tell us about the wars with Carthage and expansions into Asia Minor. How did this impact the way Rome related to its allies, its holdings, and foreign policy?
Yeah, so after Pyrrhus eventually leaves Italy. Initially, he leaves without actually having lost a battle. He loses 2 battles to Rome. It becomes clear the cost and the consequences of these battles were just too great for him to bear. He goes on to Sicily. He eventually comes back to Italy and is defeated by the Romans. Within a little more than a decade after that, or actually less than a decade after that, the Romans stumble into a conflict with Carthage. And so if you think of a map of the central part of the Mediterranean, you have Italy stretching down into the central Mediterranean, Sicily just off of the southern coast of Italy, and then south of Sicily is what's now Tunisia. But a suburb of modern Tunis is the site of the old city of Carthage. And Carthage is the dominant naval power in the central Mediterranean. But the people, whoever it is who controls this sort of stretch between southern Italy and Carthage, basically controls the commerce that moves between the eastern Mediterranean, which is very wealthy, and the western Mediterranean, which is very poor, but is also very resource heavy. And so you have places like modern Lebanon, where you have very well-developed economies, but they need resources that you can only get from places like Spain. And Carthage is in charge of that. And so Carthage has a very significant navy because it dominates this sort of commercial activity, and it controls the passes through which these go. When Rome starts fighting Carthage, it's a very interesting and unbalanced war, because Carthage is a naval power and Rome doesn't really have a navy of any significance. And so in the initial campaign against Carthage, the First Punic War is mainly fought in Sicily. And Rome has to begin that war by borrowing boats to get troops across the Straits of Messina to get into southern Italy. And eventually they realize that to actually win this, they need to figure out how to fight naval warfare on the level of the Carthaginians. And that's a lot more complicated than it sounds like, because fighting an ancient naval battle involves very significant training so that you can acquire the ability to maneuver ships very, very carefully against the current, using the wind. And the battle is won when you use a metal, basically like a metal ram on the front of your ship to puncture the hull of the other ship. And what's intriguing about this is the ships are so light that even if you puncture them, as long as everybody gets off, the ship will still float. And so ancient naval battles consist more or less of you maneuvering very carefully so that you can outflank the opponent, puncture the hull of their ship without your hull being punctured. And then everybody jumps off the ship and maybe they get rescued and maybe they don't. The way Rome sort of starts fighting this is they get a Carthaginian ship that has washed up on shore. And this is a very complicated ship that they get. You know, it's not like a little fishing boat. It's a very complicated warship with multiple banks of oars. The rowers on this ship need to know how to work together. The commanders need to know how to command the rowers so that the ship can be maneuvered. And the Romans get this ship and they don't really know how to build it. They don't really know how to maneuver it, but they reverse engineer an entire fleet based on this captured ship. And then they put out to sea, and the Roman sailors freak out because they don't know what to do. And so the first sort of engagement they have with the Carthaginians, the Roman sailors basically freak out. They give up some of the ships, and the Roman commanders realize they need another option. The option they come up with is ingenious and also crazy. Because instead of fighting a naval battle, what they do is they put a gangplank with a spike on the Roman ships, And then they just sail up next to the Carthaginian ships, drop the plank, and then send in to conquer the ships like it's a land battle. This gives you a sense of how adaptive the Romans were, and also how crazy they were, right? Imagine telling Marines that, yeah, we don't really know how to fight a naval battle, but we're going to go out anyway. And yeah, you might die because we might not know what we're doing, but here's this plan we have, and this is what we're going to do. And the Romans do it, and it actually succeeds because the Carthaginians have no idea how to defend against this absolutely crazy thing they're doing. But the Roman campaigns against the Carthaginians consisted more or less of a less developed society with tremendous manpower and willingness combating a richer and more sophisticated society in Carthage. And the Romans are able to defeat them in essence because the Roman society is willing to take more pain. It's willing to suffer more casualties. It's willing to pay more. Every time they lose a fleet, they build another one. In the First Punic War, the main consequence of this was that the Romans take out loans from their civilian population to continue to build fleets until Carthage cannot actually afford to continue to fight the war. In the Second Punic War against Hannibal, what you see is a Roman population that's willing to absorb massive casualties and go on the equivalent of a total war footing, where massive percentages of the eligible men to serve in the army, and Rome outfits huge numbers of its citizens and goes on a war footing for the better part of 15 years. And in that context too, they basically are willing to take more pain than Carthage. And so the Punic Wars are the consequence of a society that is maybe underdeveloped economically compared to the people they're fighting, but much more willing to undergo whatever the struggle necessitates in order to defeat that enemy. And so the victory in the Punic Wars is, in a sense, a testament to the nature of Roman society more than it is a testament to the genius of Roman military commanders.
Yeah, they literally just had more bodies to throw at their opponents at the end of the day. And I think, as you point out in the book, that continuation of the battle, like the unwillingness to give up, is really also predicated on the fact that Rome's position as a dominant Italian power is really depending on them not backing down. If they back down, they have allies, they have other places in Italy that are beholden to them who are going to see them as weak. They have no choice. So they have to kind of work on this balance of people who are really wary of funding this war and keep going on with, the fact that, oh, if we give up now or we make concessions now, everybody's going to look at us and they're going to kind of like go, okay, well, if they couldn't do that during this battle, then perhaps maybe we could give it a go and, revolt here or there, So, just very interesting what's going on here.
Yeah, that's the genius of Hannibal's strategy. What Hannibal understood was that the power of Rome drew upon the willingness of Rome's allies in Italy and the willingness of people who were Roman citizens, but also were living in different cities, to absorb that pain. And most of the people in Italy that were willing to absorb that pain were willing to do so because, frankly, they thought that Rome was going to win. And if Rome won, they got the benefits of that. They shared in the benefits of that victory. And Hannibal's genius was in inducing Rome to take massive casualties repeatedly. And there's 3 battles where Hannibal basically inflicts huge casualties on Rome. And after the 3rd of those battles, Hannibal starts pulling away from Roman allies. And Rome's battle strategy against Hannibal after that was to avoid these massive battles against Hannibal, and instead use smaller detachments to shadow Hannibal and pull back some of those allies that Hannibal had induced to betray Rome. This was an understanding that this was a system based on people being willing to cooperate with Rome, and Rome's many defeats in the early stages of that war against Hannibal put that system at risk. It wasn't until Rome reestablished that deterrent capability and also that promise that if you cooperate with us, you will share in the benefits, that it was able to again stabilize its position in Italy.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I really loved about the book was pointing out that you have the system in place that's working, but because of the expansion, because of the wars, because of the many spoils of wars that are coming into Italy, it's kind of creating a sense of inequality between people. What's argued in the book is that the economic and political infrastructures that had worked so well for Rome in the past were ill-equipped to handle the rapid growth and expansion in the wake of the Punic Wars. So I didn't know if you could just kind of elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, so after the Punic Wars, when Carthage is reduced, what Rome finds is a large vacuum in the southern part of the Mediterranean, but especially the eastern part of the Mediterranean, where Greek city-states that have been drawn into this conflict, or Greek kingdoms that have been drawn into this conflict by Carthage, begin directly confronting Rome again. And Rome then finds itself engaged in a series of campaigns in the eastern Mediterranean, where it absorbs large amounts of territory and resources. And Rome doesn't have a financial structure or an economic structure to absorb those resources very efficiently. It also has no interest in creating a bureaucracy that will empower people to run this territory. And so Rome creates, in a sense, a contractor model where individuals can pay for the privilege to operate mines in the provinces or collect taxes in the province. They commit a certain amount to the imperial or to the Roman Republican treasury, and then whatever else they make beyond that is their profit. And these contracts can become really, really lucrative, but the Republic requires you to pay in advance. And so this generates a financial market where people will loan money to these contractors to go out and collect taxes or do whatever they're doing. The contractors then will pay these people back over time as the contract is fulfilled. But the loan actually can be valued because you can judge the likelihood that the loan is going to be repaid, and you can come up with, in a sense, a value for that loan, which enables the people making that loan to sell the loan off to investors or use that loan as collateral to buy something else and recapitalize themselves. And so it creates a financial market in Rome that is flush with money because these loans become the equivalent of financial instruments that back multiple kinds of transactions and provide a source of money that isn't coined money and isn't in any kind of physical form, but is a massive part of the Roman economy. But the thing that we of course understand from living through the financial catastrophe of 2008 is that not a lot of people understand how these things work. If you are one of the people who understand how financial instruments work, you have the potential to become really, really, really rich. Because frankly, there's a lot of money to be made if you can efficiently move these large quantities of wealth around and invest them capably. And so it generates, as in the United States, from the 1980s till now, massive inequality. As a few people understand how this economy works and do really well, a lot of people more or less stand still. Of growing wealth inequality, not so much because poorer Romans are getting poorer, but because richer Romans are getting super wealthy on the proceeds of this empire. And the sort of know-how about how to monetize the resources that they're taking in a fashion that exponentially grows the amount of money in the economy.
That's a great point. And another point you make in the book is that even among wealthy Romans, like certain Romans are getting richer, but then certain other maybe more prominent families in the past are not really seeing that growth as well. And then they're, for lack of a better term, kind of poor in a sense. Like you have like families of like 13 or 14 living on the same farm or whatever. It's very interesting. And yeah, along with these conquests, along with these contracting sorry, let me cut that. So yeah, along with these contractors, you have not only the potential for a lot of fraud, a lot of on top of that, you also have in these wars, Rome is confiscating lands. and they're also the land distribution. There are certain rules that go with holding land, but those are also being subverted. So it's just kind of a problem that the situation shows the cracks kind of in that Roman facade of unity, where you have people in the past, like kind of like the Appius Claudiuses, who were very much like for this ideal and not putting themselves above the gain. They're now you have this new generation of people who are in offices and in power who are not above or adverse to financially enriching themselves and using their offices and the power that they have to kind of create more prestige for themselves.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about considering the electoral and political implications of this economic change is that poor people can't enable you to win a Roman election. There, frankly, are not enough of them distributed in the correct way for you to win an election on the basis of poor people. You win an election on the basis of sort of wealthy people. And so when you start seeing the effects of this economic change in Roman political life, what you're seeing is not rich against poor. What you're seeing is, in essence, super rich against kind of rich. And the challenge that you are appreciating when you look at that in that particular way is this wealth inequality is not about rich and poor. It's about the super rich becoming kind of unapproachably wealthy and the kind of rich feeling left behind. And so the tension really is among the people who are well off. A few people are doing really, really, really well, and regular rich people don't feel like they can compete. And so this creates a political dynamic that then enables the not quite so rich people to capitalize on also the discontent of poor people. And one of the issues that poor people feel particularly strongly about is some of these rich people are beginning to use their resources to buy large estates near the coastline and near major roads. You still, if you're in a sort of small village in central Italy that's not really on a major highway, you're still basically going to be doing the same thing that your ancestors have been doing. It's not going to be dominated by large estates. But if you're like sailing along the seashore in Campania, you'll look, and all of a sudden, instead of small fisherman villages, you're going to start seeing big villas run by rich people. If you're traveling along the roads in the countryside, when you get to some of the major roads, you're going to start seeing larger villas that are staffed not by regular Roman peasants, but by slaves. And so there's something that these upper middle class or upper class but not super wealthy people can capitalize upon, which is the impression that poor people are also being left behind. And at the same time, more and more people are struggling to meet the qualification that Romans set so that you have enough property to serve in the army. And so you start having a problem where Rome has greater and greater needs for troops because it's now fighting wars, everywhere. Just in the year 146, it destroys the city of Carthage in North Africa. It destroys the city of Corinth in Greece, and it's also fighting campaigns, in Spain. So you have fighting all over the place. You need more troops, and yet the number of people who can meet that property qualification is declining. And so you have a series of problems that all build on each other that enables people who belong to that rich but not super rich class to become demagogues and to draw upon the discomfort of the rich but not super rich, the society feels like it's spinning out of control, and the desperation of the poor people who do look around and see the world changing in a physical and very demonstrable way. And so this is starting in the 130s when you start seeing the rise of a sort of demagoguery that undercuts a lot of the ideals of the Republic.
Yeah, that reminds me, and I'm just going to get into him because he's super important to this kind of period of time, that demagoguery that playing upon your kind of personality, cult of personality, to rally people behind you. And of course, I'm talking about Tiberius Gracchus. So tell us more about Tiberius Gracchus and his brother. How did his ascendancy and downfall lead to this major turning point for the Roman Republic?
So Tiberius Gracchus actually belongs to one of these old-ish elite families. And so the person who had won the war against Hannibal was Scipio Africanus, and he is connected to Tiberius Gracchus through his mother's side of the family. His father's side of the family is derived from a man named Tiberius Gracchus also, who was an adversary of Scipio, who also eventually turned to be an ally. And so Tiberius Gracchus comes from this really, really prominent family of leading figures in the previous couple generations of Roman history. And he's positioned to really be an insider candidate who will run straight to the middle of Roman political life and, lead a kind of establishment put forward an establishment political program that's going to give him a really conventional sort of track through the offices of the Cursus Honorum and ultimately maybe to the consulship. But during service in Spain, there is an incident where the person he's serving under more or less gets captured and has to make a disreputable peace agreement with the Spaniards that people in Rome, conservatives in Rome, disavow. And Tiberius Gracchus is attached to this, not because he was personally responsible for the defeat, but because he helped negotiate this particular agreement with the Spaniards. And this ends his ability to run as a conventional establishment candidate. And so he has a couple of options. He can kind of recede back into kind of anonymity. He'll be in the Senate, but he won't actually have the level of achievement of his immediate ancestors, or he can figure out how to run in a different way. And what he decides to do is run as a figure who, in terms of his political presentation, is a kind of burn it all down revolutionary. But what he's actually proposing is not to burn it all down. What he's proposing is a pretty modest set of land reforms that will in essence involve enforcing existing laws against people who have more or less gotten away with holding too much public land. And he just wants to enforce the law that says there's a limit to how much public land you can rent, take the excess and distribute it to poor people. But he's framing this as, I'm going to, rally for the poor of Italy, and I'm going to solve this problem of land allocation, and I'm going to make you feel better about wealth inequality. The problem, of course, is that, first of all, his proposals won't solve any of that. And then second of all, the proposals that he's putting in place are actually not even going to really impact Roman citizens. They're going to impact people who live in allied territories, who are the primary people renting this land. And so there's pushback in the Roman Senate that says this law is not a good idea. What Tiberius Gracchus then does, instead of negotiating a compromise, which would be what a Roman would be expected to do, he instead uses his rhetorical power and his popular backing to depose the colleague who's blocking this law, and then push the law through anyway. And then when the Senate objects, he pushes it through again, using more or less threats, intimidation, and the power of a kind of mob that's very, very energetically behind him. And so what Tiberius Gracchus represents is not radical policy solutions. It's instead radical approaches to implement those policies through threats, intimidation, and the specter potentially of political violence. When he announces then that he's going to run for the same office again, his opponents more or less panic and believe that these threats may actually become violent, and then organize an attack on him, and he's murdered. And it's the first political murder in Rome of a Roman politician in over 300 years. And so it's a very, very significant moment in Roman history. And the question is, did Tiberius Gracchus bring this on himself? His opponents say, he spent a year demagoguing, using threats of violence, using intimidation, bringing these mobs of people together so that they can be vocal and loud and threatening. And we just did what was a natural thing to defend the Republic against somebody who looks like they're going to overturn it. Tiberius's supporters said he never did anything violent. There were threats, yes. There was loud speaking. There was, you could potentially be scared about the energy that he was inspiring in the crowd, but he never used violence. Violence was used against him. But the problem you get after Tiberius Gracchus is violence now is a political tool. And people in the Republic have shifted from trying to peacefully erase their so that they get maximum support in the Senate, or convince people that their policies should not be blocked. Now, instead, what you have is the use of violence, force policies down that would be opposed to them. Necessary because violence now is an option.
Ed, sorry to interrupt, but your mic is cutting in and out. I'm not sure if that's working, if that's affecting the audience. I'm sure when I download this from StreamYard, it'll be fine. But if you could just do a test really quickly, just like speak and say something. Okay. Or let me tell you what. Let me remove you and you come back in just for a second. And this will all be edited out, so don't worry. But I just want to make sure that it's not like just on my end, if that's okay. So I'm going to remove you and then just come back in really quickly, and then we'll go from there. I apologize. Okay. So 1 second. Sorry, everybody. We are live. Dr. Watts will be right back. There he is. Okay. So it's better now. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry about that. I had the same issues the last live stream I did. I'm editing that now, and it's just a nightmare. It's like, oh my god, because we were talking over each other. It was a great talk. It's a great video. I just have a lot of work left to do on it. So,
hopefully, Hopefully, it does go up. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's been great just for that one part. But we're talking about Tiberius Gracchus and just his rhetoric of violence. It's very I think he really did, just from reading the book, and of course you have in Plutarch those hugely colorful illustrations that he does of the mob like breaking the tables, and like, he really did bring it on themselves, because he really did spend that year just like inflaming, and stoking the fires of like violence and resentment. And then he had a problem, like you said in the book. He's getting what he wants, kind of, but now he's got to worry about, like, I'm not protected by this office after I'm out of it. What do I do? Yeah. Oh, I gotta, run it again. So then you have Plutarch just talking about how I think it's the Pontifex Maximus, and actually, like, wasn't it his father-in-law, right? Who
it's
I can't remember.
The chief priest in the Roman religion, who's also connected to Tiberius Gracchus, relative to Tiberius Gracchus, who leads this. And so the idea that Tiberius Gracchus is causing significant problems runs pretty deeply in the Roman state. But I think that the long-term implications of Tiberius Gracchus are so significant, because it says, in essence, Romans are much more willing at this moment to condone a kind of primal scream of anger than they are to seek and even desire an actual solution to the problems that's causing this anger. And what Tiberius Gracchus shows people is there's not a policy solution to this. You're not going to make people feel better about the way Roman society is working by just simply pursuing policy goals. They need to feel better because you need to let them scream, and you need to let them do something to the people they feel are doing wrong to them. And Tiberius Gracchus and the people who killed Tiberius Gracchus gave you a new path to do that. And that's really, really dangerous, because what Rome, you can compromise on policy. You can negotiate a policy that gets you, 90% of what you want. And if you believe that policy is the way to solve a problem, you can work with people who are ideologically opposed to you and figure out a policy that you can both perhaps be on board with. And the Roman Republic is based on compromise. It's based on this idea that, that nobody should single-handedly dictate a policy or a solution or an idea or an approach to something. What they need to do is work with their colleagues to find something that gets broad enough support that everybody in the Roman society feels like they have had an input, indirectly perhaps, but some input in how this particular policy was framed. What Tiberius Gracchus says instead is, first of all, policy doesn't really matter. Symbolic rhetoric and symbolic action matters more than actual tangible changes to the well-being of people. And then second of all, people are not willing to sit still for compromise anymore. They're angry. They feel like the system has failed them. And they're actually okay expressing that anger, even if the problem that they're angry about doesn't really get solved by that anger. And this is what the next few generations of Roman politicians learned from Tiberius Gracchus, that mobilizing the anger of people is an effective political tool, even if you aren't going to solve any problems that they're particularly concerned with. But if you can mobilize that anger and solve the problems, then you have a very strong and unassailable position of leadership. And this is what you see in the next generation with people like Marius and Sulla. They figure out how to solve some of these problems for the people who support them, while also letting these people give vent to the anger and frustration that they feel about a society that seems like it's pulled away from the ideals that they embrace.
So tell us more about Sulla and this next generation.
So one of the things that that we see in people like Marius and Sulla is, they do understand that the problem with land and soldiers is one that Rome has to address because of its military needs, right? It needs to enroll huge numbers of soldiers to fight in all of the wars all around the Mediterranean that it's fighting. And so what Marius decides to do is remove the land requirement. Once he removes the land requirement, there's not a problem getting soldiers, except that these soldiers now are not the same kind of part-time soldiers who will go back to the farm and continue working the land that you would have had 100 years before. Now these soldiers are primarily looking to fight for profit, and they're fighting for pay and they're fighting for profit. And so what Marius understands is that these people are tied to him as their commander. And that if he can give them what they want, both in winning victories, of course, because winning victories in the ancient world means you get to loot things. So winning a military victory isn't just like you feel good about your country. It's also you feel good about your country and you steal whatever it is that you can get from the people you've defeated. So winning victories is good and you're happy with that. But what Marius also begins to realize is that he can build a political client base if he can bring these soldiers back into Rome and give them something that empowers them so that materially they're better in the long term. And so what he decides to do is to not only reward his soldiers with the sort of booty that comes from winning victories, but also with a pension, with land, more or less, to settle on when they're done with their military service. This is a model that that Sulla, who is Marius's great rival when you get into the 90s BC, also adapts. What Sulla recognizes, though, is that these soldiers are not just useful as political clients in peacetime, but they also can be mobilized as an army that will fight a civil war for their commander. And so there is a military command that Sulla particularly wants that will be particularly lucrative in Asia Minor. And Sulla is initially given the command, but Marius uses a political ally to get Sulla stripped of the command and gets the command given to Marius instead. Sulla then goes to his army and convinces his army to march on Rome so that the command can be restored to him. And there's other aspects to this as well, but the key part of this is Sulla goes to the army, tells them that they are being robbed when he is being robbed, right? His loss is also their loss in Sulla's rhetoric. The senatorial officials and the people of sort of senatorial rank who are with the army, almost all of them object to this and refuse to march on Rome. But the soldiers who are dependent on Sulla for their material well-being, they agree and they march on Rome. And so what you see there is a move from mob violence, which, in the 130s is what is leading to the death of Tiberius Gracchus, to actual civil war. Where Tiberius Gracchus mobilizes people and his opponents mobilize people and they fight in the streets of Rome. Now you have people who have been enlisted in the army to serve the Roman Republic and fight for it, instead marching on the city of Rome and fighting for their commander instead of their country.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And we actually had a discussion about that in your book, Rome's Eternal Decline and Fall, the eternal decline and fall of Rome. This is a problem that, starts here and it doesn't really end. It just keeps going on, but takes maybe different forms throughout history. One of the things I really loved while researching your book is that I got to reread Plutarch and I got to really look at Cicero more closely. I never really appreciated Cicero, when I was in college and, I would do some philosophy courses. I found it kind of boring, but like reading your book and actually reading on the Commonwealth and the laws and just how he framed everything and just reading a good commentary on it, I kind of got a newfound appreciation for him and his thoughts. So it would be remiss. I know we're running low on time. It's already been an hour. I don't know how much time you have, Ed, but I really want to talk about Cicero, and then we'll get into, the people everybody are here for, which is, Caesar, Marcus Antonius, and Octavian. But we'll get into that. But just kind of, can we talk about Cicero just to kind of appease me? So who was Cicero? Yeah. Why were the models he set out in the Commonwealth and law so important?
So I think Cicero belongs to this generation of people that they experienced what Sulla brought. They experienced the Civil War. They experienced, after Sulla won the Civil War, and the Civil War has, a number of phases, but after Sulla wins the Civil War, he executes large numbers of people and confiscates their property, and it's really terrible. And so Cicero and people like Julius Caesar and people like Pompey and people like Crassus, all of them lived through this, and all of them in their political careers as they mature want to avoid this, and they really want the Republic to work. And Cicero is a sort of the most sophisticated and eloquent theoretician about how the Republic should work. And so when you read things like the Laws and the Republic, which are quite late works, these are written after basically things are not working anymore. But these are quite late works where Cicero is theorizing exactly how the Republic should work. And what in principle a functional republic ought to do and how it ought to resolve differences and what it ought not to do in terms of managing its resources and managing political personalities. And Cicero, I think, theoretically really did believe these things. But the challenge that everyone in that generation has is the guardrails are all broken. Sulla has shown really that if you don't want the Republic to apply to you and you can build enough power, it doesn't apply to you. And all of these people in this generation really want the Republic to work. But nobody is really quite sure how you make it work when in the back of their mind, everybody knows it doesn't. And everybody knows how to break it. And everybody knows how it was broken before. And everybody knows that it could be broken again. And so you see in Cicero's rhetoric something that really is different from Cicero's behavior. And so Cicero talks about, upholding the Republic and not using violence and, and relying upon the legal system to resolve discrepancies and disputes. And then in cases like, the murder of Clodius, who's Cicero's great rival, Cicero goes out and says, you know what, it's okay to murder Clodius because Clodius was, he was impossible to control. And what do you do when it's impossible to control them? Well, you have to kill them because the state can't control them. And do you really punish somebody who's responsible for killing someone, on the Appian Way in a giant mob battle? No, because he killed Clodius and there was no other way to deal with Clodius. And so you look at what Cicero is saying theoretically, and then what Cicero is actually saying in practice, they don't match up. Cicero is perfectly okay with political violence if it's political violence used against somebody that Cicero doesn't like, and Cicero doesn't feel like there's any other solution to dealing with this person. And that, I think, in a nutshell, is a way to sum up that entire generation. Julius Caesar actually, I think, wanted the Republic to succeed, but he also wanted to be able to do what he wanted. And if he had to choose between doing what he wanted and the Republic succeeding, he would choose to do what he wanted because he didn't trust the guardrails of the Republic to hold if his opponents tried to do something in revenge for something that Caesar had done before. Pompey really wanted the Republic to work, but Pompey also wanted the Republic to work on his terms. And so if the Republic working meant that Pompey needed to stand down in a conflict with Caesar and acknowledge that maybe Caesar is sort of Pompey's more or less equal, Pompey didn't want to do that. And he didn't trust that the Republic would protect him if he did step down, because he didn't believe that the Republic could force Caesar to step down as well. And so this entire generation falls into the same trap that Cicero does. Theoretically, they really saw the damage that Sulla had done. They didn't want to do that. And yet they didn't trust that the Republic could protect their interests and protect their objectives. At least they didn't trust it enough that when push came to shove, they would let the guardrails of the Republic protect them because they didn't believe that it could. And so every single one of them who didn't want a repeat of what Sulla brought about eventually brought about a repeat of what Sulla brought about. And this is how you get to the Civil War in 49, beginning in 49 BC. These are all people leading the Civil War who don't want a civil war, but they also don't see any other way for them to get what they want politically and to protect their positions personally without fighting a civil war. And so even though they knew what this would bring, they did it anyway because they didn't really feel like they had any choice. And Cicero, I think, embodies this conflict and this kind of irreconcilable difference between what theoretically you want and what practically you're willing to do, more than any of the other ones, simply because Cicero is so eloquent and so capable of expressing his ideas, both when they are theoretically what we want to see, and then also when practically they diverge from the theoretical republic that he wants to create and he wants to live under.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a common theme throughout the entire book. And sorry, Ed, I know we're running low on time. Do you have time for like 2 more questions?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I know I always try to do an hour, but I think it's a common theme throughout the book that people are always constantly in a struggle between how they theoretically and ideally see things and what the Republic should be and their own self-interest. And they're more often than not making decisions that, little small decisions over time, which is a common theme in all of your books, I think. People make small decisions over time that create these changes. And we go from maybe the Republic of the 3rd century BCE to the Augustan freedom of the late 1st century So in your book, you note that the conflict between Pompey and Caesar was the final march from the Republic to the Empire. So I didn't know if you could just elaborate on this.
Yeah, so Pompey and Caesar in the late 60s start out as allies. Caesar is a very compelling, very charismatic figure. And when Caesar runs for the consulship, he's blocked by Cato, who is Cato, again, is another one of these figures who is conceptually very committed to the idea of the Republic. But in practice, he does lots of things that disrupt the proper functioning of that Republic because it's not consistent with what he himself wants to get. So one of those things that he does is he blocks Caesar, and he blocks Pompey, and he blocks Crassus, who's the richest man in Rome. And so Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus set up an alliance, in a sense, where they will use their resources, Pompey as a famous general, Caesar as a very charismatic politician, and Crassus as the richest man in Rome, to advance the objectives of the other two, right? So they all combine as a team of three to make sure that they use their resources to advance the programs and policies that each of them want. And Cato is overwhelmed by this. And so across the 50s, what you see is this alliance between Pompey and Caesar erodes. Caesar goes and conquers Gaul. Caesar becomes much more famous as a successful general than Pompey because of the war in Gaul. And he also becomes extremely rich. Crassus dies in a military campaign in Syria, and then it's just Caesar and Pompey. And Caesar looks like the rising sun and Pompey looks like the setting sun. And this causes tension between the two of them as well, because Pompey doesn't like that. And Caesar doesn't like not being acknowledged as Pompey's equal. This leads to a conflict where Caesar's command in Gaul is supposed to expire. His allies and Pompey still has a military command. And so Caesar and his allies get concerned that Pompey has an army and Caesar very likely won't have an army. And they try to negotiate a compromise where Pompey will give up his army in exchange for Caesar giving up his army. They both will return. They both will run for office because that will prevent Caesar from being prosecuted. And Cato and Pompey, but primarily Cato and his allies, block this from happening. At this moment, then Caesar panics and orders his troops to march into Italy, setting off a civil war. And so the conflict between Pompey and Caesar was something that grew out of the fact that neither one of them fully trusted that the political system would protect them. And so both of them felt like they needed to have soldiers who were loyal to them to protect their person and protect their liberty in case the political system no longer would do this. And so ultimately what that shows is a failure of the Republic to do what it was advertised to do, and to fulfill the promises that it has made to its citizens. And so, I think this is why you can see on one level, it's a very public repudiation of the Republic's ability to function as planned. But it's also something that destroys the ability of the state to control the military resources the state possesses. Because what you now have is Caesar has gone to war against the Senate. Ultimately, Caesar wins that civil war against the Senate, and it's clear now that the military resources of the state are loyal to Caesar. They aren't loyal to the state. And so this is, I think, on two levels why you can see that this conflict is really something that effectively is the end of the Republic.
And of course, we all know what happens to Caesar ultimately. In the wake of his assassination, you have a new triumvirate created to fill that power vacuum. The most prominent members in this are, of course, Mark Antony and Octavian. And of course, just by virtue of the fact that both are tied to Caesar, sorry, let me start over. So yeah, just by virtue of the fact that both are tied to Caesar so closely, you have kind of a power struggle there of like, who's the rightful heir? So what happens is you have this final nail in the coffin, so to speak, of the Roman Republic. This is when there's this long civil war between Mark Antony and Cleopatra and Octavian. Octavian's waging this really insane like propaganda battle in Rome against Cleopatra and Mark Antony. And he's using if anything, I have to give Octavian props for just how effectively he understood how to use these propaganda tools to create kind of self-mythologize and kind of turn public opinion. So tell us about this final nail in the coffin of the Roman Republic.
So I think that one of the things that we sometimes miss when thinking about Octavian, who becomes the first Emperor Augustus, is that Octavian is a very, very smart and observant character. And so what Caesar believed was when he eliminated the senatorial opposition to himself, he believed that you could bring the Roman state back together without doing the kind of mass murders that Sulla did. So Sulla won the civil war and then killed lots of people to get rid of potential opponents. And while he was winning the civil war, he killed lots of people to get rid of potential opponents. And so when Sulla took over after the civil war, there were not many potential opponents left. What Octavian realized is, so what Caesar did after he won the civil wars, he pardoned as many people as he possibly could. If you fought against Caesar, but you asked for pardon, he not only pardoned you, he brought you back into the state. And so Brutus and Cassius, the people responsible for murdering Caesar, ultimately had fought against Caesar and were pardoned and brought back into the state. And not only brought back into the state, they were brought back into the Senate, and they were brought back into offices within the Roman state. And what Octavian had realized from that is you cannot recreate the Roman Republic by pardoning people who have opposed you. You must kill them. And so the civil war that Octavian fights is a civil war that brings to bear all of the lessons that he's learned from watching what Caesar did wrong. And also what Caesar did right. What Octavian realized is, you win these civil wars not by playing nice with the Senate, not by catering to, aristocrats. That helps. And if you can make that work, great. But what you do is you get the loyalty of your troops, and you get the loyalty of the best troops first. And so Caesar's armies are the most experienced armies that Rome ever had. Those are the core of Octavian's support in those civil wars. And he builds out support for his armies by always being sure that there are resources to provide for them. But those resources are his resources. They are personally tied to him. And when he wins, or if you somehow find yourself in territory he controls and you're an opponent of him, you will possibly die. You will possibly have your property confiscated. You will be removed from position of public authority. And while this civil war is fighting, while this civil war is fought, Octavian is particularly brutal in doing these things because he understands that this is how you win. But what he also understands is once this is over, you need to come up with a way to reconcile people. You need to come up with a new model. And so when the war is over, when Antony is defeated, when Brutus and Cassius are defeated, when all of the adversaries that are out there are defeated, what he then tries to do is bring the state together, not by pardoning people who had opposed him, but by creating a new kind of elite that is built from people who were loyal to him. And he also makes it entirely clear that the soldiers are going to be paid from his resources, that public expenditures will never be able to be met from the resources of just simply the Roman state, but his resources must always supplement those, and those resources are discretionary. And so if you want to do well in this Roman state, you need to play nicely with Augustus. And so this is how the empire is created, through all of the lessons that Octavian had learned watching various moments in the Republic fail. And so the empire is kind of built on the set of approaches that Octavian takes to fix the problems that he had identified in the reconstructions of the Republic that had occurred in the 1st century BC.
Yeah, I really think it's important to emphasize that nobody just woke up one day and there was an empire, or the day before there was a republic. Augustus lived so long that the people, you emphasize this in the book, Augustus lived so long and he made these changes so gradually through time that by the time that he died, there was literally nobody alive who even remembered that period of time, or rather lived through that period of time. He understood from the lessons that he learned. I think he actually learned a lot of lessons from Cleopatra as well. I was doing we were supposed to do a show, but something happened, and I was doing some research on Cleopatra with Dwayne Roller's book, and I really think Augustus took a lot of lessons from her as well. And I think Augustus knew the point of the propaganda and emphasizing this. This structure cannot exist without me, and he convinced the people that it could not exist without him. You read his Res Gestae, And that's all it is. It's like, I paid this out of my own pocket. I did this, that I funded this, when, the grain was down, or, we were low on food, I used my own reserves, things like that. And he really created this picture that set up this empire literally where it became invisible. These things were kind of invisible to a lot of people. And by the time, he died, it was the empire. It was Augustus's new empire. And that existed for quite a while and endured. So if you have any final thoughts about that, you'd like to share, Ed, please go ahead, because love to hear your thoughts always.
I think on that point, what's really important is Augustus always claimed it was still the Republic. And the office of emperor, even into the Byzantine period, I mean, I'm now writing about the 7th century AD in the course of this big work I'm doing on all of Roman history. Even then, it's clear that the imperial office is not something that you as emperor possess. It's something that you're entrusted with. And so the idea of the Republic is that you as an office holder, you're in a sense renting that position. And you have an obligation to maintain the state because of the people who came before you. But you also have a responsibility as the person holding that office to maintain the state for the people who will come later. What Augustus does is he changes the discussion about what the Republic is. And he makes himself the person responsible for superintending it. But he doesn't ever claim it's gone away. And this is an idea that is actually a very important one for the people after Augustus, because even emperors that you see as somewhat tyrannical, they even do not claim that this is their personal possession. They claim that they have a position that is entrusted to them by the Roman people and by the Roman Senate, and it's their obligation to perform the duties that are expected of them by these people who have entrusted the position to them. And so, I think this is the genius of Augustus, is he understands that you can effectively take control as a monarch, but you don't need to call yourself a monarch. You can create a position that seems like it's perfectly in keeping with this Roman idea of entrusting office to somebody for a fixed amount of time and then handing it off to a candidate after your time is done, and make it a lifetime appointment. And make it basically a monarchy without ever claiming that that's what you're doing. And so you maintain the spirit and rhetoric of a republic, even though you've done something entirely different from that republic.
That was the genius of Octavian, and the benefit of lesser despots like Caligula and Nero, for sure. Yeah, this has been a pleasure as always. I want to personally thank you for all the contributions you've made to the show and the canon that I'm building. You've been an integral part, a very early adopter and believer in the show, and I appreciate all your encouragement and everything that you've done. And I hope that this is just one of many conversations we will continue to have as the show progresses. I want to thank everybody for watching. Next live stream will be the Halloween special, and I wanted to pick a extra spooky topic, but it's also a kind of serious one that we don't really think about. And so next week we will be talking with the reigning, defending, undisputed lifetime heavyweight champion of the show, Matthew David Litwa, about the evil creator and the origins of an early Christian idea. And don't worry, this won't be in the actual video. This is like after show thing. Yeah, I just want to emphasize that anti-Semitism is an issue that has continued to be a problem, and the evil creator focuses on the ancient roots of that with the writings of people like Manetho, like Apion, like Chaeremon. But I want to emphasize that this is an issue that continues to plague us, and of course we all know what I'm talking about. I condemn, Dr. Litwa condemns, I'm sure all of my guests condemn any form of dehumanization, any form of racism, any form of anti-Semitism that exists in this society, this world, and humanity. And hopefully it's something that we can all combat and recognize and hopefully our discussion next week will tackle some of these topics from Antiquity. I want this show to be not just a springboard where you guys send me super chats and I have the guests do tricks on command because you sent me $5. I want this to be something substantial that you think about and that you all learn something from, and that I learned something from. So I appreciate everybody for watching and appreciating the show. Even if I had 5 subscribers, you would all be the best. I made my 500. If we hit 1,000, we're at 900 right now. That's fine. But like I said, this show is about the scholars. The show is about us learning something together. And this show is about making a difference in this world. So, yeah, with that being said, Ed, Dr. Watts, thank you so much for joining us. You have a pleasant morning, or actually afternoon where you're at.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed this, and I'm happy to come back whenever is good.
Absolutely. I will definitely take advantage of that because you are an integral part of the show. And yeah, until next time, thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next, I think it's Thursday. Yeah, so Thursday, October 26th, we'll have some special guests. We'll talk about spooky movies, and maybe I'll read that awesome Pliny the Younger epistle where he talks about the haunted house. It's one of my favorites. Maybe some Lucian's Philopsudes. Need some Athenodorus in that ghost with the rattling chains in her life. And yeah, we'll talk about the evil creator and condemn bad actors in this world. And what I hope you take away from the show, just one last parting thing, is a lot of the lessons from this book, we need to realize they're going on now. There are certain actors in this world who are not adhering to like due process, like in terms of like if you have a gag order, you're not supposed to say anything. Everybody as a person has to respect what these laws and these institutions say to make this thing work. And if we have people who are just flaunting that, then it's not going to work. So I hope we take the lessons from today as something we can all keep in mind. But until next time, like I said, I'll shut up, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, everyone.